The political fight, meantime, in Michigan is on. Voters there head to the polls for the Democratic Senate primary on Tuesday. But more than 1 million people have already cast early votes. Progressive candidate Abdul and establishment Congresswoman Haley Stevens, they're going head-to-head, not just for the seat, but for the direction of the party. Here with us is U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail, Victoria Churchill. Victoria, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So Stevens and El-Sayed, they've been, sharing their final pitches to voters this weekend before the primary on Tuesday. Here's what they've been saying.
I'm in the best position to beat Mike Rogers. I will run through anyone and anything to make sure that Michigan is heard at the lawmaking table and in the halls of power.
Living in an America where things are too expensive, where they're worried about what's going to happen if they get sick, about where their next paycheck might come from, if there's going to be a data center put in their backyard that's going to automate out their job. And they deserve a whole lot better than they're getting.
So many people are watching this race, not just because of who wins, but because of what it says, right? So depending on who wins on Tuesday, what will it tell you about the state of the Democratic Party?
Well, Michigan is one of these perpetual penultimate swing states in our current politics. And so it'll be interesting to see who comes out of that nomination. Some of the latest polling from Emerson College has El-Sayed up, particularly after Mallory McMorrow dropped out a few weeks ago. So, we're seeing El-Sayed in, like I mentioned, the latest Emerson poll, they've got him at 54%, with Stevens at 39%. And what we also see is younger voters, as well as voters that identify as independent, leaning towards El-Sayed. And I think that's a shift from what we've typically seen. I think independents typically identify as independent because they're more moderate instead of more progressive. But of course, we've seen folks like Bernie Sanders, who was a longtime Democrat, become an independent. And I also think we see in other states, of course, not far from Michigan, we have Nebraska, where there is no Democrat primary, no Democrat Senate candidate there. After the primary, there is just an independent who is one of these progressive, almost Democrat socialist aligned, has some ties to that side of the Democrat Party. So this is really interesting to see whether these progressives can gain any momentum outside of just some coastal, very blue cities, people that are kind of long-term, old school Democrats, seeing where they'll split. Now, as I mentioned, the older voters are actually going towards Stevens, with the younger ones going towards El-Sayed.
What could a progressive win in Michigan, though, really say about the sentiment of voters nationwide?
I mean, I think it goes to show that people are unhappy with business as usual. But, of course, with El-Sayed, I think you have to look at that there's been some hypocrisy in some statements that he said versus how he lives his life. There's some financial disclosures that came out a few weeks ago that he has, properties overseas and that he's a landlord overseas, as well as, I believe, one property in Michigan. And, he's also one of these people that pushes for Medicaid for all, but his wife actually is a doctor and she does not take Medicaid at her practice. So there's definitely some hypocrisy in his rhetoric there.
On Saturday, I spoke with former acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney about this race in Michigan. Here's what he told me.
When Donald Trump swept through the Republican Party, what did it tell us? It tells us that all the energy in the Republican Party was out on the populist right. If El-Sayed wins the Democrat primary in Michigan, it tells us something very similar about the Democrats, which is that all of the energy is out on the very, very far left, progressive Democrat socialist wing of the party. And that is the type of thing that can rip parties apart.
Do you agree with that sentiment, that the energy is on the progressive left?
I mean, it definitely seems to be, because for some reason the progressive left is more motivated to come out and support their candidates. We've seen that, of course, in New York, I think, is the images that you're casting up there.
Yeah.
Of course, we saw that with the Maine Senate primary. Even now that we have a different nominee, I think they both represent a very similar, more populist ideology. But I also want to point out that, this is some things that we saw even in 2016 to 2020. There was a phenomenon, I don't know how widely it was covered nationwide, but it was definitely something that I paid attention to, where that there was people that voted for Bernie in the Democrat primary or in caucuses, for example, in states like Iowa, and they actually ended up being Trump voters in the general election. And so I think there's just still a lot of people that want anything beyond the typical, party talking points, party donors, candidates that are supported outside of those groups.
What is the Republicans' plan nationally to combat this?
I mean, I think a progressive win in a state like Michigan is probably something that Republicans are more excited about. I also think we're looking, for example, at states like Minnesota as well. If they nominate more of a progressive candidate, I think Republicans are going to have an easier time making their case. But we have done our own polling over at the Daily Mail that shows that Republicans are now down on the generic ballot. And so it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. Of course, generic ballot looks nationwide, or people planning to support Democrat, Republican, or undecided. Republicans at the same time are raising a lot more money. And so, that's another thing that we'll have to look at when it goes down to these race by race messaging wars. Republicans are going to have a lot more in the coffers in many cases. But I think Republicans, with the war, I was just on my way here, I was listening to the radio. They're saying national gas prices are about $4, and in the DC area where I am, people are paying even more. So those are definitely things that people are going to be keeping in mind as they head to the polls, not only in primaries, but also in November.
Some of the criticism, I think, that I've heard about Republicans when it comes to these progressive candidates is that, okay, well, the progressive candidates are at least talking about affordability. They're talking about those gas prices, where Republicans might be kind of skirting the issue. Have you heard the same?
I mean, I think some rhetoric that we heard in the last few months out of the White House hasn't necessarily been helpful, where the president was kind of hesitant to acknowledge the affordability concerns of a lot of Americans. But I also think that particularly when you go down to the swing districts, Republicans are willing to spin the work that particularly in the House has been done. Of course, things have been caught up, I think, a lot in the Senate, but I think the House has been able to actually tap into some of those things by, of course, we had, the tax bill just over a year ago, but we've also seen things like the housing bill passed out of the House. I think particularly for House lawmakers, it's going to be a little bit more easy for them to make the case that they are concerned about those things that their voters are.
Yeah, the messaging, though, around the economy for Republicans, at least, doesn't seem to be landing. I mean, we've got, Trump's approval rating now sitting below 40%. So what do Republicans need to do to turn that around?
I mean, I think personally, the longer this war goes on, the harder it's going to be for Republicans when it comes to November. The Pentagon's about to go back and ask Congress for even more money. And so those aren't headlines that voters are going to want to be, reading, and things that they want to be paying for when they can barely afford their own things in their own house. If people are able to balance their budget at home, they're asking why Washington can't do the same thing.
All right. U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail, Victoria Churchill. Thank you.
Thank you so much.